Here's this week's Steam Code raffle winner. I give a Steam Code for a free game away with every video I do, and all you have to do to enter is leave a comment that wouldn't violate Twitter's terms of service. Make sure you have contact info in your YouTube profile so I can reach out to you. A complete list of games to choose from is in the description below. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a chance to win. Now on with the show. I'm playing something almost every week, and sometimes I want to talk about it and give you a vertical slice. So stick with me for some lightning reviews. This week on the chopping block. As I alluded to last week, this week I've been playing the Resident Evil 4 2023 Remake. For a very brief recap of last week, unique shooting controls made for a system of rewarding the player for anticipating obstacles and careful observation, but led to frustration in close-quarters combat scenarios. Additionally, the shift of survival horror to campy action horror was a welcome one, and the original game in and of itself still held up. I concluded by saying that I hoped I wasn't going to be burning myself out on Resident Evil by mainlining both the original and the remake back-to-back, and while I can't say I've done that, I've come darn close. Upon starting the remake, I'm instantly struck by the increase of visual fidelity. The game drips with bloody detail, ominous shadows, and is wonderfully atmospheric. Unfortunately, at least to me, the darker tone isn't only expressed in the visual details, but is leaked over into the mood of the story. In broad strokes, the story is largely unchanged from the original, taking time to give more explanation and depth to characters and cutscenes, but from the very first cinematic, you know that this rendition is going to be taking itself far more seriously. That's not saying it doesn't have its moments where it at least references its formerly campy nature. It keeps some of the iconic lines as well as over-the-top boss fights, but doing so much more straight-faced, and as such comes across as far less enjoyable for me.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
In the very least, they've made Ashley less annoying as a character, although that's come at a significant detriment how she affects gameplay, but I'll get to that later. Speaking of gameplay, though, that's the next major adjustment. Having quite literally had almost 20 years between the original and the remake, it has adopted numerous sensibilities in order to facilitate far more comprehensive controls, and therefore giving the player far more power to deal with a wider variety of scenarios. I mean, go back to when I was playing the original version many years ago, and my mind would have been blown the second I was able to aim and move at the same time. Inversely, with every improvement that they've made to controls, they've had to balance it out with some other factor. You still have the iconic resource management and attaché case, but now they've also included crafting. I'm not necessarily going to bemoan this in and of itself, but one thing I will complain about stems from the new stealth mechanics and the fact that you're also far more capable with your knife. In order to keep things tense, your knife can now break, and you have to spend resources at the merchant to fix it when it happens. The first time this happened, I outright told the game to f*** off and went off to go do something else for 10 minutes. You can obtain other knives when exploring levels that can be used for either a similar combat role or as crafting materials to make other weapons and ammunition, but they have far less durability than your combat knife, but back to the point. The condition of the knife is also dependent on its general use in combat, and the fact it can now be used in a parry mechanic when opponents are meleeing you. However, in almost every scenario where opponents were close enough for me to be getting struck, I was usually getting dogpiled, and this resulted in me having to start a segment over. I feel like the parry mechanic is somewhat antithetical to the optimal mentality, which I'm finding myself far more appreciative of. Resident Evil 4 to me was never a game that was at its best when I was flying completely off the cuff and reacting in the moment. It was a game that excelled when I was formulating a plan or anticipated the hazards that were to come, began acting off of those plans, and then seeing how the world reacted to me. For me, resorting to a knife in close quarters combat often meant a failure of planning, and the parry mechanic never seemed to help me in those scenarios. Speaking of the world reacting, combat has become substantially more frustrating. In the original Resident Evil 4, you could almost guarantee that every shot placed on the enemy would cause them to react somehow, whether it was just them staggering or strategic placement of shots on limbs to gain a desired effect. This still mostly happens, especially with holding particular weapons or items, but in the event that I was getting a little bit more cramped and having to go for center of mass shots, they usually just kept advancing, tanking whatever damage I was dealing to them, and inevitably costing me part of my health bar. And let's not forget that depending where you are in the story, you may have to kill the same enemies multiple times. The first time I encountered an enemy that I thought I'd dispatched, with their neck broken sideways and staggering towards me completely divorced from the shell of humanity that had once occupied, was slightly unnerving, but pretty much every instance after that was strictly an annoyance. In fact, most of my frustrations come from the game seemingly liking to spam villagers in scenarios, theoretically to increase tension, but there are a few segments where I became aware of the trick and knew it was going to happen. For instance, after an area had been cleared out and I was scrounging around for resources, I would find a little alcove with some boxes, and as I was approaching, ready to harvest whatever was inside, I would think to myself, it's gonna spawn some of these behind me when the surrounding area had been completely devoid of villagers prior, and lo and behold, my powers of clairvoyance were established. Of course, having so recently played the last one, I didn't need clairvoyance to be able to tell where the story was going. The pacing has been significantly affected, though, by shifting away from a strictly linear controlled story. Resident Evil 4's remake features a much heavier emphasis on backtracking and exploration, almost in something of a Metroidvania mentality. On its face, there's not too much wrong with it, but it begins to run counter to the tone that the story is trying to set. When I'm taking an extra 10 to 20 minutes to backtrack across half the map in order to scour for collectibles and treasures to sell, it kind of undermines the sentiment that time is of the essence to save the president's daughter. Speaking of which, as I alluded to before, they put much more effort into giving realistic characterizations to the other cast members, and while Ashley comes across as less annoying in the story, they unfortunately made a significant shift that made her an absolute monster to deal with in the segments that I had to escort her. In the original Resident Evil 4, geez, I'm starting to lose count of how many times I've said that, you could either hide Ashley in particular props and clear out a zone, only calling for her once the area had been made safe, or barring that, you could in the very least tell her to hold position in an area you knew was going to be slightly safer for her, even if an enemy could still theoretically get to her. While some set-piece moments have places for her to hide, now she always follows you. You can have her follow at distance or up close, but nonetheless, she is still another factor now moving around the battlefield, and given the non-reactive nature to how some enemies received my shots, I was occasionally unable to save her between getting dogpiled in whatever capture she had refusing to register the bullets I was putting into their spine. I'm gonna give this as a broad message to the gaming industry. Your escort quests. Given the frustration I'd already had with the aforementioned enemy spamming, coupled with actually now being perpetually joined at the hip to an instant game over if they ever got too far away from you, I elected to put the game down for a while and play when I feel like it. It's by no means a bad game, but the Resident Evil 4 remake seems to be an attempt that at almost every turn takes one step forward and then immediately takes a step back. The increased graphical fidelity is countered by its darker and less fun tone. The more comprehensive combat and controls are countered by a more frustrating utilization of enemies. The shift to emphasizing backtracking and exploration for resource drags down the narrative tone and intended pacing. As I said at the start of the review, I'm not burned out on Resident Evil, but it's gonna happen if I force myself to continue playing this remake. And given that a lot of the things that I praised the first game for have been de-emphasized or stripped away, I don't see myself having much more fun with this one. Call me a Luddite if you must, but I'd probably have more fun putting quality of life and graphical improvement mods onto the original rather than continuing with this remake. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go more in the shutdown of the 3DS and Wii U shop. Hey, look at that, it's the end of the video. Don't forget to subscribe, and remember that commenting can actually win you a free prize. So until next time, this is Gheeotine saying thanks for watching and keep your head on your shoulders.